Old houses, you see.
Yeah.
Plus the heat. And now many families have.
No, you can't.
I'd been walking around Chefchaouen, thinking I was beginning to understand this place. The blue walls, the narrow streets, the extraordinary doors. Everything I traveled here expecting to find. And then I met Abdul. Within minutes, he started pointing out things I'd been walking straight past, things I hadn't even thought to question. And that's when I realized maybe I'd been looking at Chefchaouen completely wrong. Yes. Red, blue, murals stretching along both sides of the avenue. And this was interesting because I traveled here carrying an image of Chefchaouen dominated by a single color. Yet before I'd even reached the famous Medina, the city was already complicating that image. Color here wasn't simply something applied to old walls. It was being used to communicate, to decorate, to distinguish spaces, to create identity. And perhaps this was my first clue. Maybe Chefchaouen wasn't going to be understood simply by asking why everything was blue. Maybe I needed to start asking what all these surfaces were trying to tell me. And then I reached the entrance to the old Medina. I love moments like this because gates aren't simply ways into old cities. They change your sense of space. Outside, wide roads, cars, movement, the modern city. And then you pass through an opening like this, and everything contracts. The streets narrow. Vehicles disappear. Your pace changes. Your attention changes. It's almost a physical reminder that you're entering somewhere designed around a completely different rhythm of life. This wasn't simply an entrance. It felt like a threshold between the Chefchaouen I'd been walking through and the Chefchaouen I traveled here to understand. By now, I wasn't particularly interested in simply walking through beautiful blue streets. I'd spent enough time in Moroccan Medinas to know that what initially appears chaotic often isn't chaotic at all. In Fez, I discovered neighborhood systems hidden behind what looked like a maze. So naturally, I started doing the same thing here, looking for patterns. Why does this street become wider here? Why does another suddenly become residential? Where does commerce end and neighborhood life begin? Why this doorway? Why this symbol? Why this particular detail? Instead of looking at individual blue streets, I started trying to read the Medina. But there was a problem. I was still interpreting everything as an outsider. And no matter how carefully you observe a place, there are things you simply don't know enough to see. Then I met Abdul.
Decode, this more than 600 years old.
More than 600 years old?
Yeah.
Okay, wow.
Today you stay here or you leave?
Today I'm here. I'll go to Acture.
Yeah, actually, yeah. To the waterfall. Nice.
Yeah.
You got a car?
Yes.
It's a nice one. Actually, it's nice.
Yes.
You will like it, brother.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, man.
Abdul wasn't a guide I'd booked. He was someone local who became my friend, and this was his neighborhood. Within minutes of walking with him, something changed. Not necessarily the streets, my understanding of them. Abdul didn't stop at the things I'd been photographing. He noticed the things I hadn't. He pointed, explained, remembered, and suddenly the Medina wasn't something I was trying to decode from the outside. Someone who belonged here was allowing me to see it from the inside. And that's when something occurred to me. Abdul wasn't looking at Chefchaouen. He was remembering it. The streets weren't interesting because they were blue. They contained people, relationships, stories, memory.
Very nice here, you see.
Ah, wow, okay.
Don't see this. You see this before?
No.
May I bring you to the nice
Nice places. Yeah, this is good.
Because you are my friend. You are like my family. Bubble one.
Okay.
Okay, you understand?
Yes, I understand.
Italian hotel.
Italian.
Yeah, Terra Hotel, Terra Boutique. Italian
yeah.
guy, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how long have you been in Chefchaouen? All your life?
All my life. Me I do this tour. Born at 60 years old.
Okay.
I never been to the school.
Never been to the school?
To the Quranic school when I did 4 years, 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Abdul is in his 60s, born and raised here, and has spent his entire life in this Medina. And you can tell, because while I'm carefully negotiating steps, watching where I'm going, and trying to remember which corner we just turned, Abdul moves through these streets like they're an extension of himself. He's remarkably nimble, quick on his feet, quick with a joke, and seemingly incapable of walking past someone without acknowledging them. But what struck me most was his excitement. Abdul wasn't simply taking me somewhere, he genuinely wanted me to see his neighborhood the way he sees it. Every few meters he'd stop, point, explain something, then disappear around another corner as if to say, "Come on, there's more." And I found myself almost chasing after him. So what's this alphabet?
A, B, C, D.
A, B, C, D. Oh wow, so
Yeah.
Berber alphabet.
Yeah, Berber alphabet from Rif Mountains, brother.
Oh wow.
Purple, yeah, man.
Nice.
Yeah, purple.
Nice.
Yeah. Hey, be careful, brother. Yeah, man.
These weren't streets he'd researched. They weren't stories he'd memorized for visitors. This was his world. 6 decades of memories, relationships, and everyday life compressed into these narrow lanes. And suddenly, I wasn't following a tour guide through Chefchaouen. I was following a man through his own memories.
You make a round, you say to me tomorrow, and then we meet.
Yes.
You understand? Perfect, huh?
Perfect, yes.
Double, yeah.
The longer I walked with Abdul, the more I realized I wasn't really being shown a collection of streets. I was being shown a community. Every few steps there seemed to be another greeting, a familiar face, a quick exchange, a joke, and then Abdul was off again. There was an ease to the way he moved through this place that you simply can't imitate as a visitor, because after more than 60 years, he doesn't navigate Chefchaouen using street names or landmarks. He navigates it through people. This corner means something. That doorway belongs to someone. That neighbor has a story. And somewhere along the way, I realized that perhaps this is what I'd been missing while trying to decode the Medina on my own. I had been looking for a system in the streets. Abdul was showing me that part of the system was the people themselves, and that's something no map could ever have shown me.
water for you must be fresh.
Okay.
To make you
Fresh.
yeah,
Yes.
man.
I need it. I need the
You
fresh.
need it, of course.
I need the fresh. And almost immediately, Chefchaouen began feeling different. Those people sitting outside weren't part of the atmosphere. They were neighbors. These weren't picturesque blue facades. They were people's homes. Children grew up in these streets. Families returned through these doors. People stopped and spoke to someone they'd probably known for years. And that sounds obvious. Of course, people live here, but travel photography has an extraordinary ability to remove ordinary life from the places we photograph. We wait for someone to leave the frame. We search for the empty alley. We want the perfect blue doorway. And sometimes, without realizing it, we remove the very thing that gives the place meaning, the people. Walking with Abdul reversed that. The Medina stopped feeling like somewhere I was exploring and started feeling like somewhere people belonged. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
It's nice, huh?
It's nice, yes.
May I make you big too? No, may I make good
Good
work?
one, yes. No, you're good.
I make good work.
London.
Yeah, man, look for another wife. Make me crazy.
Yes, no, it's good. Then Abdul wanted to show me another layer. This time, it wasn't something I would ever have noticed on my own. He took me through streets locally connected with another chapter of Chefchaouen's past, its Jewish history. And as we moved deeper into the neighborhood, he kept drawing my attention to details. Then he told me to look down. Set into the ground was an 8-pointed star. And this is where interpreting old cities becomes complicated. Geometric stars occur across Moroccan and wider North African decorative traditions. So finding an 8-pointed motif doesn't automatically tell us that it belongs exclusively to one community. But in historic neighborhoods, local memory can attach particular meanings to surviving architectural details. And perhaps that's what's interesting. Not simply asking, what does this symbol mean? But, who remembers it? Who associates a story with it? And how long can those stories survive after the people who created them are gone? Suddenly, the Medina wasn't simply architecture, it was memory made physical.
Altitude from the Medina to the mountain is like 850 meters.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a taller.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, very taller.
And that's when the famous blue streets began looking different to me. There's nothing wrong with coming here for this beauty. It's extraordinary. I'd photographed it too. But perhaps the danger begins when the photograph becomes the entire story. When somewhere becomes famous for one image, we start traveling there looking for evidence of the image we already know. Blue wall, blue staircase, blue door, photograph, next. But what happens if we stop? What happens if instead of asking, where is the famous street, we ask, why does this place walk the way it does? Who lives behind that door? What happened here before I arrived? What am I walking past because nobody told me it mattered? That's when sightseeing starts becoming discovery.
The This is the name of Chefchaouen. Chef is a mean look.
Okay.
Chef is a look. Chaouen is a course. Look the course. 1 and 2.
Wow.
To understand the name of.
When I arrived in Chefchaouen, I thought the challenge would be understanding why the city was blue. 2 days later, that seemed like one of the least interesting questions I could ask. Because behind the color are neighborhoods. Behind the doors are families. Inside these streets are relationships. And beneath the surfaces are layers of memory that someone like me could easily walk straight past. That's what Abdul changed. He didn't reveal some secret Chefchaouen hidden from everybody else. He did something much more valuable. He taught me how to see the Chefchaouen that had been in front of me all along. And perhaps that's one of travel's greatest privileges. Not simply being shown somewhere new, but occasionally meeting someone who changes the way you look.
May I make you nice pictures for you?
Yeah, no, good.
Please make a video, please.
Yeah. Ooh, this is nice.
May I take you best places better?
Yeah, this is nice. Chefchaouen will probably always be known as Morocco's Blue City, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. The color is extraordinary. It draws you here. It makes you curious. It invites you through the gate. But once you're inside, you have a choice. You can collect the photograph you came for, or you can keep looking, because the blue is only the surface. The streets carry the life. The details carry the memory, and the people, they teach you where to look. Maybe that's what I'll remember most about Chefchaouen. The blue gets you here, but the people teach you how to see it.
Yeah, we'll take to the laundry before.
Okay.
If the boys swimming also.
Okay.
Yeah, man. So this is the laundry. We'll take to the laundry before.
Okay.
Yeah. Make a photo for the children swimming also, huh?
Okay.
Yeah, man. Very nice, huh?
Okay, wow. Oh. Yes.
Take one from Alex.
Yes, very well. Yeah.
Abdul, I am a friend of you, huh?
Yes, you are indeed Abdul. And leaving
Nice to meet you.
Chefchaouen,
Big
Abdul had
welcome,
left
huh?
me thinking about something else. What happens when a city's identity isn't shaped only by the people who live there, but by centuries of people arriving from somewhere else? That question would follow me to my next stop, Tangier, a Moroccan city that has spent centuries looking out at the world.
We are in Castle. The castle is in castle, is the most high point of Tangier. Castle has 5 areas: artistic area, Andalusian area, Jewish area, Arab area, and Hebrew area. And we are not the high point of Tangier. For this reason, this town is a strategic town. That's the reason why everyone was Scotland. Because in 1912 was here 8 countries in 1961.